I would like to now call on Fleur Wouterse, who is a Senior Research Fellow in the Africa Regional Office and the co-editor of the 2017-2018 Annual Trends and Outlook Report. She's going to give us an overview of the report. Fleur?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I was one of the editors of the report, together with Alamayo Seou, and we solicited about 15 chapters, I think, from various experts on the topic, and I'll just be presenting some highlights of the findings of the report. I haven't done much research myself on social protection, but I did, through actually reading the chapters and writing the introduction and a conclusion, get a good sense of what's actually going on the ground in Africa. So a bit of more of a motivation. I think Ousmane already started to talk about it, but one of the reasons why we chose social protection as the topic for this A-tour was actually that while the emphasis in Africa remains on agriculture-led growth as the engine really for poverty reduction, it's also become clear that even if growth is inclusive, it may still not be enough to lift everyone out of poverty. So, and I think in addition to that, because most Africans still make their living from the land, they are particularly vulnerable to weather-related shocks and natural disasters. And so there's quite a few households for whom food insecurity is almost a daily reality. And so to actually then take part in and benefit from the growth process and from the growth that is going on in Africa, there is a need for households to have some level of basic capital and security. Okay, and so this is where social protection programs can actually play an important role. So these are often public or private initiatives that help the poor and protect the vulnerable against livelihood risks. And they can actually be effectively used to assist those trapped or at the risk of being trapped in chronic poverty. Yet if you look at the figure I'm going to present, you can see that the coverage of social protection is extremely low in African countries. So what you see here is that over 80% of households in sub-Saharan Africa had received no transfer. I think this is maybe a couple of years back, these data from the IFPRI database from the World Bank, which has also got all kinds of interesting stuff on social protection figures. And so you can see that, I mean, there's a large number of households that have remained uncovered, especially in comparison to other regions. Okay, and so then to get into a little bit more detail on social protection. So social protection roughly has these three objectives. So the first one is the protection part, so protecting households against hunger. Then the second one is preventing household depletion, so in the face of shocks usually. And the third one is actually to promote livelihoods. So how can households actually go graduate, in a sense, from having to need social protection? So, and I think our next presenter is going to talk about this a little bit more, so I'm not going to really dwell on this for too long. But the idea on the promoting livelihoods notion of social protection is that when households are actually operating in this environment where markets are missing, which is the case in rural areas of African countries in general, social protection can actually affect agriculture production and productivity. And the idea is that this can happen through roughly 4 channels. There were actually 3, but I made them into 4. And this is also something that's discussed in the A-tour itself. So you see that it can actually reduce these liquidity constraints and so encourage spending on agricultural inputs. It can actually facilitate small-scale savings or investment, for example, by acting as a collateral and enabling households to access credit. It can actually affect risk attitudes by altering household wealth. So you may be more likely to actually take a risk because you feel that if all else fails, someone will be there to kind of, catch you. And then affect food and nutrition security, which may in turn enhance labor productivity. So that's this kind of study that we've been doing for a while, where you actually say, so if you're, for example, healthier, you're actually more productive also on the land, if you will. Okay, and so just to say something about these Cash Plus programs. So usually when we think about social protection, we still think mainly about cash transfers. So this case of transferring some cash that can then be spent kind of at will, well, unless they're of course conditional, and then there's a particular direction in which you want to kind of have the spending go. But when you talk about cash plus programs, they're actually these interventions that provide those transfers, but also have some additional components or interventions that actually are designed to augment these income effects. So it's not only a cash transfer, but there's something on top that helps you actually improve your livelihood, like itself. That's kind of the promotion notion still. And so there's these livelihood programs, which is like a wide range of interventions that help the poor acquire productive assets, build skills, or create new market opportunities. And then there's these graduation programs that usually focus on the extreme poor and actually try to reduce their poverty by tackling the interrelated challenges that they are facing. Okay, and so the reason why I'm kind of building up to that is that there's a chapter in the book by Munshi Suleiman, which actually talks about the impact evidence. And so he actually looked at these 48 programs that were implemented, I think, across the globe between 2014 and 2016. And he drew some conclusions on the basis of this. I don't think we should take them too. I mean, there are some limitations to the way he was actually able to kind of compute the costs and the benefits. But nevertheless, what he kind of found out was that there was not a clear relationship between per beneficiary cost and impact. So it was not so clear that when you're spending more, you're actually impacting welfare of the poor by more. And then what he also found out was that while annual household consumption gain as a proportion of total program cost was the highest for cash transfers, they actually had the least amount of evidence of a long-term impact. And then he compared cash transfers, livelihood programs, and graduation programs. And so for the livelihood programs, he found actually this limited sustainability of impact. So he actually looked at, did the program still have an impact after a year, after it was completed? And he found very limited evidence of that. And then actually when he compared the three, he found out that graduation programs are actually the most consistent in having a significant positive impact across sites. And so I have these two little figures to illustrate this a little bit. So what you can see, so this is for all programs, and so what you can see is that the cash transfers kind of hover around the median, and so you can also see that there's not such a clear direction between the amount of spending and the impacts, right? So that's what I just mentioned. And then a second graph he prepared was to look at the impacts after 1 year. And I mean, so what you can see from here is that when you actually look at the sustainability of the impact, these graduation programs have this kind of relatively consistent score in the high cost, high impact quadrant of the graph. So that's just kind of to illustrate. I mean, there's a lot of noise in this regression, so you have to understand that they're very different studies. He had to make some assumptions to actually be able to compare costs and benefits, but this is just to give you an idea. So, and this is something that was already mentioned by Usman. So there's actually two trends that will determine the future demand for social protection in African countries. So what we've seen is that even though there's been a recent economic recovery in Africa, high poverty rates have remained relatively high because the period of decline and stagnation was actually pretty long. And so not everybody's been able to bounce back from that. And then in the second trend is actually that we have this transition towards more democratic systems, a larger urban population, which is also often more vocal, and which actually may demand that the government do more to actually protect the poor. So there's this twofold challenge essentially being faced by governments of African countries. So on the one hand, there is still this need to find sufficient resources to invest in accelerating growth. And on the other hand, they also have to meet the costs of providing social services to large numbers of poor and vulnerable people. So you can see that in terms of a budget constraints, that may be a little bit difficult. And of course, then you also have the fact that most of these countries are already operating under tight budget constraints and have this limited experience with social protection programs. So you see that this is still a huge challenge. So what also emerges a little bit from the research that was done for the book is that some countries are actually moving towards a systems approach. And so I think the future is really countries are looking to actually come up with these nationally owned social protection systems, like we've known them in Europe, in the States, I guess. And so that would mean that you actually have this comprehensive social protection response. You have these, you can offer a broad range of coordinated multi-sector interventions to your beneficiaries, and you actually add this extra dimension of these systems being transformative. So really being able to change the status of the household. And so one chapter that really looked at what are some of the design features that should be considered to make these systems a success was this chapter by Rachel Sabates-Wheeler. And then there was also this chapter by Gashau and Kala for Ethiopia that actually looked at some of the design features with reference to the PNSP, the Ethiopian program. And so I think these letters may be a little bit small, so maybe we shouldn't have to. I'll just try to. So the first one is this idea that came out is that in some cases universal targeting may actually be preferable, and that really comes out from this discussion of we are all poor here. So you're making this extreme effort to target the poorest of the poor, and in that effort, which is very costly, you have to get a lot of information, you have to conduct a survey, and you're still really comparing like households that are all kind of balancing around the poverty line. So should you really make that effort? Is it really worth to try to make that distinction? Or should you say in some cases where the situation is one of a flat income or asset distribution, should you say, okay, we're just going to have a blanket targeting policy? So that's one. And then second, there's this idea that no one size fits all. So while the targeting can be kind of, universal, the type of program may have to differ between the type of household. So not all households are in the same situation and have the same needs. So it is important to actually recognize this heterogeneity, because that's actually going to help you help your program to be more effective. And then finally, and I think that we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that this idea that you need to promote graduation. So the social protection, putting in place the social protection scheme is not the end in itself. The end should really be to put it in place and then to try to see how households can actually then graduate from it. So I'm really talking about rural households, not about pension schemes, because that's going to be more difficult. But to really see what do households need to actually be able to get off the cash transfer program. And then finally, and this emerged mainly from, I think, the study of Gashau and Kalle, is that we really need to have this local buy-in. So even though, of course, donors have been very active in trying to kind of, pioneer, test these schemes, what eventually you're trying to look for is actually something that's country-owned and led. Because that also means that actually it responds to these local conceptualizations, and it's actually, governments are actually accountable to what's going on, and they can actually, defend themselves against their constituents to say this is what we are actually doing. So that's also kind of an important point to make. And also I think that maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, there's also a need for government ministries to collaborate on this, right? Because we're not only talking about cash transfers, we're talking about really programs that have to be coordinated with the Ministry of Agriculture. For example, I think maybe Natalia is going to say a little bit more about that too. So then finally, so two key lessons that I kind of drew from the report, that there is this need to make substantial progress in developing these functional social protection systems in the coming decade. And it's extremely important, especially for the stability of the country, because you've got this demand and this idea that the notion that you actually are entitled to somehow receive some protection from your government, and also because it's actually something that can contribute to growth. So that's also very important to bear in mind. And then if we have these systems that are well designed and well implemented, they can actually really do a lot more than just sustaining poor households. They can actually enhance human capital and agriculture productivity, reduce inequalities, build resilience, and end these intergenerational cycles of poverty. So, thank you very much.